think it's close enough to 7 that we can start. Kathy just told me that I should introduce myself. I didn't know I was expected to do that. My name is Nancy Abington. I went to college at UT, and I married when my husband was in law school and I was still in school. And his name was Scott Sayers, and he came to Austin to work for Governor Conley after he had served in the legislature. I think he served in 1955, 53 to 55, and 55 to 57 as I remember it. But it's been 58 years since the assassination, so I thought today, if my mind holds out, I think I'll do okay. And I think I'm talking to the right generation, because my granddaughter, I told my granddaughter she's 12, and I told her what I was going to do. And she said, "What are you talking about, Gigi?" And I said, "Well, obviously you're not in my audience." I guess every one of you might remember some part of where you were and what you were doing when you heard about it. And I certainly do. And I'd like to go over the things that happened before the trip to Texas. Now, this might make you feel bad or whatever, but John Kennedy was the one who wanted to come to Texas. He wanted the money he was going to get out of Texas for his next election. And Lyndon Johnson wanted him to come to Texas because there was a rumor out that Johnson was going to take LBJ off of the ticket and put the governor of North Carolina, Terry Sanford, on the ticket in his place. And so he wanted everybody to come to Texas because he wanted to show that he could carry Texas big for John Kennedy. And there were a lot of people that did not want this to happen. And it took weeks to get it set up. And the part that was so bad, Dallas just said, "No, we don't want him to come to Dallas." They had had an experience with Adlai Stevenson and with Lady Bird and LBJ, where they were hustled in the hotel, and they even spat upon Adlai Stevenson. And Eric Johnson, being mayor of Dallas, just didn't want them to come to Dallas at all. And Preston Smith was governor of Texas, and he really was against it also, because he and John Conley did not get along very well. Although he was lieutenant governor, Preston Smith was lieutenant governor, and he didn't want Conley to get all that notoriety of associating himself with LBJ coming to Texas. But there were, as I said, the president wanted, and at the last minute, the president threw in a little ringer, and he said he would bring Jackie with him. And he kind of had her over a barrel because she had gone with her sister to Aristotle Onassis's yacht. And they had had a few words about this apparently, and when she came back, that was part of the agreement, that she would come to Texas with him. And um, I guess those are the main people that were involved in setting up the parade. And the worst thing that happened was that they published the parade route in the Dallas Morning News the day of the parade. And it was very touchy, and so anyway, it came about, and now Julian may come down and haunt me. He was in the press bus, but I told him, I said, you wouldn't have been in the press bus if my husband hadn't gone to John Connolly to hire you, which was the truth. And I did not know Nellie very well at this time, but John Connolly came to our apartment at the Austin Hotel every morning. He and my husband, who was in the legislature, were trying to pass a bill. I never did know what the bill was about. It was something called the gas price fix bill. But by this time, John Connolly had gone to work for Sid Richardson and Perry Bass. And so he was lobbying in Washington and in Austin. And the Basses, the Conleys were new in Fort Worth. And so Perry Bass and Nancy Lee Bass had a party for them to introduce them. And they had a big vacant lot behind their house overlooking the Trinity River. And they hired the Gainesville Circus, which was a one-ring circus, and set it up on this, and this was their welcome party to Fort Worth. And when we drove up, the biggest man I ever saw in a gorilla costume opened the door for me. And it was quite an evening. It was a beautiful setup, and the people were all from Gainesville, and they took this circus on the road. This is where I really met Nellie, and Nancy Lee Bass asked me. She had lived next door to my husband growing up. When he was growing up, she was grown. But she asked me to take Nellie around and introduce her to people. And Nellie and I became fast friends. And we traveled on the campaign trail. And one sequence of events we went to all the heritage sites in Texas. And we had 30 women. And if you can imagine trying to take care of 30 women for 5 days on a campaign bus, that's when I said it was like frogs in a wheelbarrow trying to keep them in there. And we had all kinds of things happen. Some of them went home before it was over. But anyway, we went to almost every small town in Texas where the Heritage Trail is. Nellie and I formed a habit of watching as the world turns every day. I don't even remember what it was about now, but we watched it wherever we were. We watched as the world turns. And when she was out of town, if I was, we used to go downtown. I don't know why we went downtown to the stores, I guess, but if I was downtown, I'd go by the governor's mansion and go up the back stairway and watch as the world turns. And as it happened, I was racing home to change my clothes because Scott and I were supposed to take a reluctant Preston Smith and his wife to the airport. They did not want to greet John Kennedy, and So I went by the house and I put on the only dress that I had that had a hat, because Ima Smith always wore a hat. And so I put my lavender hat on, and I was trying on the dress, and they interrupted As the World Turns. And it was 12:35 or 12:45 or something close to that. Anyway, I jumped in the car to go to the governor's mansion because the Conleys' youngest son was my oldest son's age, and Mark stayed with me most of the time when his father was governor because he hated the governor's mansion. But I jumped in the car and went to the governor's mansion, and Nellie's mother, Katie Brill, who was a real character. She worked for the Austin Recreation Department, and Katie was there with Mark and their daughter Sharon, and I can't remember who else was there. Johnny, the older boy, and he was on the telephone talking to his mother in Dallas. And Nellie said, "No, none of you children are to come to Dallas." Said, your father has not been operated on yet, and we are going to wait until the operation is over, and then we'll evaluate it at that time. And Johnny got off the phone, and he called the DPS, and he called the National Guard or somebody, and he got a plane. And so his mother found out about it. So she said, "Who's with you?" And he said, "There's two Nancys here." And the other one was Nancy Nagley from San Antonio, and she had the biggest Onderdonk painting I ever saw. They were going to give it to the Kennedys at the luncheon that night. And so, anyway, I jumped in the car with Johnny, and we got on this little bitty plane. It was the only thing that was left. All the reporters had gotten every plane in town trying to get to Dallas. And I never did, I can't remember whether Nancy Nagley went with us or not. I just kind of lost track of her. But Nellie told him to bring me so that I could deal with the family. And there was a lot of family there by then. And she couldn't have any peace to herself. She had to entertain the family. So we got to Dallas, and we kept having to circle in this little bitty plane. And it was because the president's plane was still on the ground, and they were waiting for Judge Sarah Hughes to get there to swear Johnson in as president. And also there was a NASA plane circling that had Dr. Shaw on it, who was going to operate on Governor Connolly. And when we got on the ground, finally, Dr. Shaw, they had a car waiting there, and Dr. Shaw piled all of us into the car with him. When we got within sight of Parkland Hospital, it was a sea of people. Harry Hines Boulevard didn't exist. It was just totally full of people. And one of the people jumped out of the car we were in and cleared a way for us to get in. And when we pulled up at the emergency entrance to Parkland, the cars that had been in the motorcade were covered in tarps, but they were still there, and they were being guarded, sort of, not really very well, but they were being guarded so that nobody would touch any of the evidence. And I don't remember who met us. It could have been Julian, I don't know. he was trying to set up a press office and Parkland Hospital was not used to this sort of thing happening. They had no private rooms in the hospital. It was at that time, it was a charity and a teaching hospital. And they were not equipped for all this to happen to them in minutes. And it was kind of a wild sort of situation. But anyway, somebody took us upstairs, which was right outside the operating room, and Dr. Shaw went in, and Nellie was looking through a window into the operating room, and she said, "Go take care of the family in there. I can't do it anymore." And so I went in, and two of John's sisters, Blanche and Carmen, were there, and Nellie had a sister, and she was there with her husband. Her name was Sheba. And so I did my best, and Eugene Locke and Adele Locke were there, and Bob and Helen Strauss. These were all old Conley people that had been with him since the beginning. And so I tried to get them all coffee and make peace, whatever was going. They just wanted a lot of information that I didn't have. And Nellie was looking through this window, which was outside the door, and she was looking into the operating room. These are all makeshift things that happened because they were not even thinking about anything like this happening. And finally this woman showed up. Her name was Stormy something or other, and she was the PR person for the Adolphus Hotel. And she gave me this big envelope full of keys. And she said, "We've cleared the 5th floor, and you give these to anybody in the family or people that have come from out of town." And so I handed out the keys, and we all visited, and everybody was kind of in shock. And everybody was trying to tell what they were doing when this all happened. Everybody had a story. But at least it kept Nellie out of there. And this went on for quite a while because the operation that Dr. Shaw performed was on the governor's lung. One of the bullets, it's never been decided which bullet really hit him. The Warren Commission said it was 2 bullets, and Nellie said it was 3 bullets, and John said it was 3 bullets. And and people said 1 bullet hit the curb. And anyway, they decided at some point that the second bullet that had gone through President Kennedy's neck went into John Connolly's back, who was sitting on the jump seat in front of him, and it went through his lung, came out his lung, went into his wrist, and went into his leg. So he was kind of turned. And the last bullet was the one that hit John Kennedy's head. That's when everything went crazy, and Jackie started climbing out, and she told the Warren Commission that the Conleys were screaming, and Nellie said we were not screaming, said I had him down in my lap, and she said that she was trying to get his brains off the back of the car, and it was all over everybody in there. And so it seemed like the operation was never going to be over, but Dr. Shaw did operating on him for 4 hours. So it was a long time, and late in the afternoon, very late, it was dark, I remember, um, everybody started sort of drifting away. And Nellie came out and said that they said that John was gonna make it and he was gonna be all right. And with that, everybody just kind of went their own way. Some of them went to the Adolphus Hotel, and I don't know what the rest of them did. Some of them went home. I think one of John's sisters lived in the area. And so after the operation was over and they talked to Nellie for quite a while, somebody took she and I to this little bitty room off of the trauma, I don't know whether it's a ward or the trauma floor anyway. And they took us to this little bitty room, and I can see it very plainly in my head. It had red naugahyde with chrome arms on the chairs and on the couch that was in there. And the only good thing that we had was a television. And we were the only ones on the floor that had a television. So we were able to keep up with what was going on pretty well. And one of the guards from the governor's mansion showed up, and people were going literally crazy at this hospital because they were getting all kinds of threats. They were putting shields on the windows so that nobody could shoot into the windows. They were just totally unprepared for this. And we stayed in there, and I remember Nellie laid down on the couch, and I was sitting in the most uncomfortable red chair you've ever seen. And I don't think I went to sleep, but I think she did, but she kept waking up kind of in horror. And she'd talk a little while, and then she'd go back to sleep. And the next morning, it was very early in the morning, they came in and said, "Mrs. Conley, the governor is awake. Would you like to go in and see him?" And she said, "Of course." So she jumped up and went in to see him. And it was not very much longer that she came back and said, "Nancy, he wants to see you." And I said, "Surely not, you're mistaken." And she said, "No, he wants to see you." And she said, "Don't be alarmed at all those tubes. They're coming out all over his body." Anyway, so I went in there, thinking she was just had misunderstood him or something. And he really did have tubes everywhere. And I walked up to the head of the bed, and he said, "I just wanted to know that somebody was with her." I didn't believe her. And he knew I had been with her when their daughter died, while we were waiting for him to come back from Washington. So anyway, that was quite an experience talking to him, and I felt like that she was really not understanding him correctly. I didn't think I had any business being there. But Parkland Hospital was a mess, and I think Nancy Gamble's husband was an intern there. She was telling, but they were very unprepared for this kind of thing to happen. And as I said, we kept up with what was going on television. And Julian kept coming in, trying to get her to make us talk to the press. And she said, "I'm not speaking to the press. I'm not going to do that." And then on Sunday, I believe it was, it was the afternoon of the shooting. And had shot Officer Tibbetts, who was trying to arrest him, and he ran into a movie theater in the south part of Dallas, and they arrested him there, and this was before Jack Ruby got hold of him and shot him, but they arrested him and brought him in. And where did they bring him? But Parkland Hospital. With all the confusion that was going on, they picked out Parkland to take him. And so we stayed in that room, I guess all day Sunday, as I remember it. It seemed like an awful long time to me. Excuse me. It seemed like an awful long time to me, and I guess it was, but we stayed in that little room, and we could not even go to the restroom without a guard taking us because they were so afraid, and they were blaming the assassination on LBJ. They were blaming John Connally. They were getting calls. It was a mess, and they didn't know what they were going to do with John Connally because as he came out of everything, because there were no private rooms. So they, after 2 days, I guess it was, they cleared out the isolation ward. I don't know what they did with those people that were isolated, but anyway, they prepared 2 rooms. And when we got up to the rooms that he was going to be in, Nellie had a room across the hall, and they had painted all the windows black. And right outside of the windows were they gave an air shaft about 6 inches wide. They put a big plate of metal and hooked it onto the building because they were really afraid. I don't know whether they ever got any shots or not, but they were afraid of shots. And the Warren Commission did not get the case immediately. The Texas Attorney General, since he was shot in Texas, and the Texas Attorney General had the case, and at Christmas that year, I was at a party at the Attorney General's house, and he was so mad because they had taken it away from him and turned it over to the federal government. But he wanted it left in Texas, and he wanted to have control of it, but he didn't. And he said that night, he said, "Never in your lifetime will you know what really happened." And I have thought about this so much. And the Warren Commission was formed, and this has been 58 years ago, and the Warren Commission was formed, and they had a big argument over whether there were 2 shots or 3 shots. And I don't know what the Warren Commission's findings were, but I know Nellie stuck, and Governor Connally too, stuck to their original thing where they said there were 3 shots fired, and there were lots, but they questioned a lot of people, and they questioned Nellie and John many times, and they set a date as to when the Warren Commission report would be opened, and it was like 4 years away. And then they kept moving it forward, and they kept turning it over to different people who didn't want to be involved, and they redacted a large part of the Warren Commissioner report. And they wanted to operate afterwards. They wanted to operate on Governor Conley and get the bullets out of his leg. And he said no. I guess they thought they could use them for some reason, as far as I know. And in the meantime, Nellie and I were still watching as the world turns. And she called me. She lived here at Westminster. And when she moved in, a good friend of hers, her husband was a lawyer here in Austin. I don't remember her name, but Nellie felt comfortable here because this friend was here with her. But she died, and she expected, I lived around the corner on 35th Street, and she expected me to have lunch with her every day. And she sat where you look out on the butterfly garden in the lawn, in those little things. And when she came in, she dropped a napkin in the other chair, so nobody would sit there. She didn't know whether I was coming or not coming, but she wanted that table. And she called me one day and said, after we get through eating lunch, would you take me to buy some Westminster clothes? She said, I've got plenty of clothes, but they're not what I can wear here. And I said, sure. So I took her to Sue Patrick's. I knew, anyway, she bought a bunch of clothes, pants and all kinds of things. And she said, I'm too tired to get these pants altered. And I said, well, just take them home with you, and I'll come over tomorrow and pin them up and take them back over to Sue Patrick's. And she said, okay. And so we didn't do the pinning up of the pants. I left. And anyway, she died that night. She was sitting at her desk right here. She had the apartment just past where the office is, Chuck's office is, and the boardroom. And I've often wondered what in the world happened to all those clothes. They must have been awfully confused about the situation. The children are, their daughter died, and Nellie never got over that, and neither did Governor Conley. He only talked about it once, and it was in a book that was called The Lone Star, and he said, I don't intend to ever talk about it again. And Nellie did not mention it in her book. And Sharon lives in Seguin, and Mark and his wife live in San Antonio. And who have I left out? Sharon lives in Seguin, and Johnny lives in Houston. He is married again. And my son told me recently that I might be under indictment if I didn't watch it. Nellie had sent me over when we were in that little bitty room with the television. She had taken off her skirt. It had blood all over it and all kinds of things. And she said, would you go see if you can find a place to brush it off or something? And they sent me underground to the nurses area. And we kind of cleaned it up a little bit. I later took it to the Adolphus Hotel, and they did clean it. And my son told me that it's on the internet right now. It says Nellie Connolly's pink suit. Nellie Connolly was one of the 6 people in the limousine at the time of the assassination of the President of the United States. And where in the world did Nancy Sayers get permission to mess with that pink suit? This is evidence tampering. So maybe I'm going to be arrested. I don't know what this other one is. I don't. It says maybe someone ought to ask Nancy Sayers if she was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy because of the pink suit. And that's on the internet right now. No way to get it off. And that's about all I can remember at this time. But I'll be glad to answer any question. Over there it goes.
I knew Sheba because I lived in Sherman for
yeah.
a long time.
Yeah.
And she was, and one of her daughters was, one of Sheba's daughters was 3 or 4 years older than my daughter.
Yeah, I knew Sheba quite well. And Governor Connolly had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. And his father had a bus line, and it went from Floresville to San Antonio twice a day. And they had a little bitty ranch down there. They had a little tiny ranch in Floresville. They called it the 4 C's. It was named after their children, but they later bought another ranch, and I was with them when they were in London, and they were tearing down the Japanese embassy on Grosvenor Square in London, and somehow we heard that they were selling off. Anyway, they bought a staircase, a beautiful wrought iron staircase, and they built this house in Floresville around the staircase. And they bought several other things, and it was quite a house, and they ended up selling it to Rosemary, who has a catering service, does all the UT catering, and she lives in San Antonio. And Nellie sold it later. Anybody else?
Were you there when the auction?
Yes.
Were you at the auction? Tell us about the auction.
Well, I was in kind of a bad position because at that time I was married to Ben Barnes, and I was part of the bankruptcy. Except we didn't have enough stuff to have a big auction like they did. But a lot of their friends, they had a list, and a lot of their friends bought things. So
I thought that was a very classy thing he did to sit through the auction of everything in his
yes,
house.
he did, and I was there. But as I said, we didn't have enough to auction off. Anybody else?
Well, I think back 55 years ago, they showed a good thing in Life magazine of Connolly looking over that Zapruder film,
Yeah.
and noted he felt that it was the second bullet that got him, and I think the turn might have saved his life because it didn't go right into his heart, but instead got to the lung and then went down that other direction, and he did indicate on the motions, if they were hit the same moment when the president's clutching his throat, he probably would have reacted if it hit him like that toward the lung, and he picked a place 9 frames later and said, no, I think I'm hit here because you see I am reacting. And it's true, a delayed reaction is possible, but when it hits something like the rib and then hits the lung and then goes into the leg like that,
It shattered his wrist too.
that's what I mean, and that usually the reaction's pretty prompt. There wasn't any issue about that last one, that blast of the president through the breathing area of the brain. Like Lincoln's shot with a Derringer, so it didn't matter what area they were in, you can't save somebody when they're injured like that.
Well, even after Governor Conley died, he had, he caught a bad cold. He caught a bad cold, and he had some sort of fibrosis in his lung.
Yeah.
And they still wanted that bullet out of his leg. I never did understand why, and his wife said, no, we're not doing that.
But he lasted 30 years after that. But
Yeah.
yet it's a good thing they were close to Parkland Hospital, couldn't do anything for the president, but that may have made a difference, my mother remarked, in the fact that he was able to get there quickly and they were able to control that bleeding.
Well,
'Cause it had
she
been a
pulled
long-
him over in her lap, and
Right.
it closed the lung up.
If that's right, but it's a good thing they didn't have a real long ride.
Well, that's true, but she said that she thought that they were trying to get the president out of the car, and that she thought they never would get John out of the car. They finally got him out, but he was second to come out.
But, well, anyway, but interesting piece of history. Now, I wasn't there, but if you don't mind, I told this to Mr. Reed before he died, when he lectured like you did. And what happened was, I was in McCallum High School, and we were at a world history class, and we were talking about the assassination of Thomas A. Becket in 1170, 800 years earlier, how Henry II said, wish they'd rid me of this. He didn't mean for his knights to go kill Becket, but they did. And we finished lecturing on that around 12:40 to 45, and we're getting ready for lunch. And all of a sudden, somebody comes in and says, I've just heard President Kennedy's been shot, so this ironically, I was learning about world history, but yet a contemporary one came on just right after the learning about a historical one of 800 years.
Thomas A. Becket.
Yep, that's what I mean, and that's one thing I'll never forget. We went down to lunch with the radio turned on, and then I sat down to lunch. Walter Cronkite made his announcement, the President of the United States is dead.
Well, I remember that day when I was walking out of the house to go to the governor's mansion before I went to Dallas. The last thing my mother said was, that dress is too long. I still remember that. And I guess it was, but I had only one hat and it matched that dress. Anybody else have anything?
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, and we thank our late friend, Mr. Reed, who died earlier this year, but he still left a book in the library.